Welcome back and prepared to be bedazzled, because another ineffably epic video is slated to commence. Today, I wanted to notify you of a problem with being exploited in the real private sector employee job market. One problem with being exploited in the real private sector employee job market is that it renders a person susceptible to imperiling his mental health. Working regular real private sector employee jobs can render a person more susceptible to succumb to chronic stress. Succumbing to chronic stress can adversely impinge on a person's well-being. Furthermore, succumbing to chronic stress can render a person more susceptible to metaphorically precipitously slump into a state of depression. Lamentably, most real private sector employee jobs based on voluntary demand are often deemed to be dead-end, highly time-depleting, debilitating, minimum wage, dispiriting, unfulfilling, undesirable, harrowing, distressful, brutally wretched, ineffably agonizing jobs that not only drain almost all of the employee's sacrosanct time, but also do not pay anything close to 1/4 of a subsistence wage for affording housing. Most real private sector employers are keen on not offering any benefits nor pension to their employees in spite of how much hard work, time, efforts, and mental bandwidth that they expended fulfilling their job responsibilities. One way to get out of financial poverty is to have your recurring revenue streams generate enough revenue to offset your recurring expenses. Lamentably, most real private sector employers do not furnish their employees with anywhere close to a subsistence wage because they are keen on minimizing their labor costs at all costs. Almost all of the profits that companies generate are reserved for its executives and shareholders. Most companies not only strive to maximize the wealth of their shareholders, but also aim to furnish massive financial compensations to their executives. Most companies are also keen on furnishing sizable retainer fees to their external directors. The board of directors also sets forth the compensation for the chief executive officer. People often grossly underestimate how financially lucrative it can be to a chief executive officer of a highly profitable company. The pay grade that the board of directors set forth for the chief executive officer's compensation is enormously lofty. An exorbitant amount of chief executive officer earn over $165 million in compensation. If a chief executive officer, for instance, earned $165 million per year in compensation, then he would be receiving almost $22.04 per second. Furthermore, if a chief executive officer, for instance, earned $165 million per year in compensation, then he would be receiving about $79,326.92 per hour. In the event that a company paid an assistant manager $10 per hour, which is $20,800 per year, and paid a chief executive officer $165 million per year in compensation, then it would denote that the board of directors consider the CEO's time to be worth 793,169% more than their company's assistant managers based on their pay grades, which they believe are commensurate with their productivity levels. If companies paid a livable wage to their employees, then a chief executive officer who earns $165 million per year in compensation may possibly need to take a financial pay cut to render it possible for the employees to receive a livable wage. A CEO who earns $165 million per year in compensation earns about 793,169% more in financial compensation per hour than an assistant manager who, for instance, earns an hourly gross rate of $10 per hour at the company. As of March of 2026, the average CEO is often unwilling to take even a modicum of a financial pay cut if it was the only way to offer the employees a livable wage. Borrowing equity out of your life, time, happiness, dignity, health, and future wealth just for a pittance of a non-subsistence wage, which at most provides you with an iota of perishable, ephemeral, fleeting short-term relief so that you can afford to buy some food, is not only an eminently inefficacious way to generate revenue, but also provides no basis for ever being able to have a financially prosperous future. You should aim to establish and build up multiple sizable recurring revenue streams to be able to offset your recurring expenses. If your income-generating assets that comprise your recurring revenue streams are able to generate enough cash inflows as an aggregate to offset your cash outflows, then you can liberate your time if you no longer need to relinquish your precious time to an employer to generate revenue. As of June of 2024, there are an exorbitant amount of real private sector employee jobs that have hazardous employee working conditions that render an employee at an extremely high probability to contract workplace injuries. Working a real private sector employee job that has dangerous employee working conditions at the employer's job site without having proper safety equipment on will render a person at an extremely high probability to contract workplace injuries, especially in contexts in which he works in an unsafe work environment and is expected to perform intense manual labor at a fast velocity. Working a real private sector employee job that has perilous employee working conditions is a grave disservice to oneself. The longer the duration that a person sustains working a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand for that has hazardous working condition at an employer's job site, the higher likelihood that he will be at to contract a workplace injury that can potentially render him maimed. A person should abstain from working a real private sector employee job that has perilous employee working conditions. Contracting a workplace injury can not only be a traumatic experience that causes immense distress, but can also be an ineffably harrowing experience that can potentially render a person maimed. If a person becomes maimed as a result of having contracted a workplace injury at an employer's job site from having worked a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand in an industry that has hazardous employee working conditions, then it can severely undermine his well-being and can also adversely impinge on his quality of life. If a person becomes maimed as a result of having contracted a workplace injury at an employer's job site from having worked a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand in an industry that has hazardous employee working conditions, then it can also render it cumbersome for him to be able to perform basic functions. Having a vessel that is severely maimed can render a person all the more vulnerable to experiencing chronic inflammation. Nothing beneficent can ever ensue from succumbing to becoming maimed. If a person becomes maimed as a result of having contracted a workplace injury at an employer's job site from having worked a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand in an industry that has hazardous employee working conditions, then it can potentially render it all the more cumbersome for him to engage in moderate intensity exercises for the prospect of reaping the health benefits of exercising. If a person becomes maimed as a result of having contracted a workplace injury at an employer's job site from having worked a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand in an industry that has hazardous employee working conditions, then it can also render it all the less of a viability for a person to pursue a career as a professional athlete in the vast majority of professional sports. If a person who is an independent contractor, for instance, becomes maimed as a result of having worked a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand in an industry that has dangerous employee working conditions at the employer's job site, then an employer is inapt to provide him with any additional remuneration for getting maimed at the employer's job site. Companies that are a part of industries that have dangerous employee working conditions rely on a fleet of independent contractors to conduct their business operations. The working conditions that a person who works real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand is exposed to at the employer's job site can be hazardous physical conditions in contexts in which the employer neglects to provide safe physical conditions to the employees at the employer's job site. An employer should never provide hazardous physical conditions to the employees at the employer's job site. An employer should always provide safe physical conditions to the employees at the employer's job site. Certain people deem it to be extraordinarily arduous for them to sustain living their lives in contexts in which they have contracted workplace injuries. As of December of 2023, the perils of working a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand in the manufacturing industry are eminently extensive. Working a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand in the manufacturing industry can, for instance, render a person prone to succumbing to rotator cuff tears, plantar fasciitis, floaters, varicose veins, sprains, strains, burns, cuts, contusions, soreness, and hazardous chemical exposure. Working a real private sector employee job based on voluntary demand in the manufacturing industry is often an ineffably harrowing experience in all facets to undergo. I hope that you were enthralled, bedazzled, regaled, captivated, mesmerized, amused, floored, and fascinated. I hope that you were entrenched in the unalloyed epicness. Thanks for watching. Have a blissful day.